There are towns in the American West where one person becomes the measure of everything else. Not because they seek it, not because they perform it, but because something about them, some quality of warmth or steadiness or simple, undeniable presence, makes everyone in a 50-mile radius quietly aware of where they are in a room. In Crestfall, Wyoming, in the summer of 1883, that person was Rose Callahan. She was 26 years old, the eldest daughter of the town's general store owner, with golden hair she kept pinned during the day and eyes that were either green or gray, depending on the light. She was warm without being soft, funny without being unkind, and capable in the particular way of frontier women who have never had the luxury of being otherwise. Every eligible man in Crestfall County had considered the question of Rose Callahan. Most of them had done more than consider. There had been formal courtships, flowers left at the counter, invitations to dances and Sunday suppers. A cattle rancher from Ridgeline had reportedly offered her father a sum that made Daniel Callahan set down his coffee very carefully before responding. Rose had declined all of them, politely, warmly, with the kind of genuine kindness that made the rejection worse because there was no coldness in it to be angry about. People had theories. She was too particular. She was waiting for someone from the city. She had taken some private vow. None of them were right. The answer was considerably simpler and considerably more inconvenient. And it had a name. The name was Will Hadley, and he was the only man in Crestfall who had never once thought to try. What no one knew, not even Will, was that time was beginning to run out.
Will Hadley was 30 years old and ran the livery stable on the south end of Crestfall's main street. He was not the most prosperous man in town, not the most handsome, though he was not unhandsome. Dark hair, a jaw made with a carpenter's square, hands always slightly rough from the work, and a smile that arrived slowly and then stayed. Other men described him as solid, which is either a compliment or a polite way of saying unremarkable, depending on who's saying it.
What Will Hadley was, without question, was good. Not in the performed way, in the quiet way. He remembered things people told him. He gave honest prices. When old Pete Marsh's barn burned 2 winters ago, Will showed up the next morning with lumber he couldn't really spare and never mentioned it. He and Rose had grown up 3 streets apart. They had the easy, unexamined familiarity of people who have always simply been part of each other's landscape. He looked at Rose Callahan the way you look at the mountains outside your window, aware that they're extraordinary, grateful they're there, and somehow never quite registering that you could walk toward them. He came into the general store on a Wednesday morning in June for nails and rope and found her reorganizing the dry goods shelf, standing on a step stool, reaching for the high shelves with total concentration. "Morning, Rose," he said, the way he'd said it 1,000 times. "Morning, Will," she said, the way she'd answered 1,000 times. He paid for his nails and rope. He left. Outside on the boardwalk, George Alcott, refused by Rose twice and philosophical about it by now, looked at Will and shook his head slowly. "You know," George said, "for a man who works with horses, you have a remarkable inability to see what's standing right in front of you." Will looked at him with genuine puzzlement. "What are you talking about?" George looked at the sky. "Nothing," he said. "Absolutely nothing." But he was thinking about something that Will didn't know yet. That Edward Marsh, the most prosperous rancher in the county, had been asking quiet questions about Rose Callahan for the past 2 weeks. Serious questions. The kind a man asks before he makes a formal offer. The Crestfall Midsummer Dance was held in the barn behind the feed store on the 3rd Friday of July. Rose did not particularly want to go, but her mother had spent 3 days on her dress, and her father had already told half the town she'd be there, so she went. in the pale cream dress with the lace collar, her hair properly done, with the composure of a woman who has learned to be graceful about things she didn't choose. The offers to dance came within minutes. She accepted some, because it would be unkind not to, and moved through the evening with the warm, genuine attention she gave everything. Edward Marsh arrived an hour in. He was 42, broad-shadowed, with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being the most consequential person in any room he entered. He had built the largest cattle operation in the county from nothing, which commanded respect even from people who didn't particularly like him. He asked Rose to dance. She accepted, because refusing would have caused a scene, and Rose did not cause scenes. He was a good dancer. He was also, she noticed, watching her with the careful, evaluating attention of a man making a decision. Not unkind, just deliberate. The kind of man who, once he decided something, did not undecide it. Across the room, Will arrived late, still slightly dusty from the stable, and accepted a cup from the refreshment table, and leaned against the wall in the comfortable way of a man happy to watch the world. He saw Rose dancing with Marsh, thought vaguely that she looked like she was being patient. She caught his eye across the room, smiled, not the public smile she'd been wearing all evening, but the other one, quick and private, just for him, gone before anyone could catalog it. He smiled back. Then Tom Fletcher appeared at his elbow, wanting to discuss a horse trade, and Will turned his attention elsewhere with the oblivious ease of a man who has no idea what he just missed. Across the room, Rose watched him turn away. Then she looked back at Edward Marsh, who was watching her with that careful, deliberate attention. And she felt, for the first time, something she had not allowed herself to feel before. The first cold edge of the possibility that waiting might cost her more than she had planned. 3 days after the dance, Daniel Callahan sat on the porch while Rose hung laundry in the yard and said, "Edward Marsh came in yesterday." Rose kept hanging laundry. "He comes in most weeks." "Not to buy anything." Daniel paused. "He asked about you, how you were keeping, whether you had any particular attachments." Another pause. The kind of questions a man asks before he makes a formal offer. Rose's hands slowed on the sheet she was pinning. "He's a serious man," Daniel said carefully. "Good standing. The Marsh operation is the most stable in the county." He was quiet for a moment. "I told him you made your own decisions, which is true." He looked at his daughter. "I just thought you should know." Rose finished pinning the sheet. She picked up the next one. "Papa," she said, "do you know why I've said no to every man who's asked?" "I have a theory." "It involves Will Hadley." "It does." She was quiet for a moment. "He doesn't see it. I've waited 2 years for him to see it, and he—" She stopped, started again. "He looks at me the way he looks at the mountains, like something beautiful that he never thinks he could actually have." Daniel was quiet. "Edward Marsh is a good man," Rose said. "And if Will doesn't—" She stopped again. "How long will you wait?" her father asked gently. She looked at the mountains beyond the town, those mountains Will never thought to walk toward. "Not much longer," she said quietly. And for the first time, she meant it. George Alcott found Will at the livery on a Monday morning and told him directly, "Edward Marsh is going to make a formal offer for Rose Callahan, probably within the month." Will was checking a horse's shoe. He didn't look up immediately. "Where did you hear that?" "From Daniel Callahan's clerk, who heard it from Marsh's foreman, who has no reason to make things up." George leaned against the stable wall. "I'm telling you because you're my friend, and because you are, I say this with affection, occasionally the least self-aware man I have ever met. Will set down the horse's hoof. He straightened. What does that have to do with me? George looked at him with the particular patience of a man who has been waiting a long time to have a conversation. Will, he said, do you understand that Rose Callahan has declined every man who has asked her for 6 years, and that there is a reason for that, and that the reason is currently standing in a livery stable pretending not to understand what I'm talking about? The stable was quiet. A horse shifted in the next stall. Will looked at George for a long moment. She'd never, he started. She has been, George said simply, for years. And Edward Marsh doesn't know that. And if you wait much longer, she's going to have to make a different kind of decision. He pushed off from the wall. I've said what I came to say. He left. Will stood in the stable for a long time after, with the specific stillness of a man whose entire understanding of something has just rearranged itself. Edward Marsh. A month. The shoe he'd been holding was still in his hand. He set it down carefully, like a man who has suddenly remembered that some things, if you wait too long, stop being available. It happened 3 days later, on a Thursday afternoon in August. Rose was walking back up the main street when she passed the livery. Will was outside, working on harness leather, sleeves rolled up, hat pushed back. She stopped. Because she always stopped. Because any time with him was better than none. They talked. The heat, the Henderson horse, the late summer rains. Then Will set down the harness leather and looked at her. Really looked. The way he occasionally did when he forgot to be casual about it. And something moved across his face that she hadn't seen before. Not quite recognition. Something more urgent than that. He took a breath. Then, before whatever courage had arrived could leave again, he said, and he didn't make it a joke this time, didn't soften it into self-deprecation. Rose, I heard about Marsh. She went still. I have no right to say anything about it, he said. I know that. I've had no right for a long time because I never said what I should have said. He looked at his hands, then back at her. But I need to tell you something before you make any decisions. I should have told you a long time ago, and I didn't, because I convinced myself it was impossible, and I was wrong about that. The street was warm and dusty. Someone was hammering down the block. She waited. I love you, he said. I think I have for years without knowing it. And I know that might not change anything. But I couldn't let Marsh... He stopped. I couldn't let you think nobody saw you. Because I see you. I just was slow to know what I was looking at. Rose looked at him for a long moment. Then she took one step closer and said, low enough for only him, Will, I've been saving my heart for you, for years. I just needed you to show up. She held his gaze, long enough for the words to land, not long enough for her courage to fail. Then she said, quieter still, don't make me wait anymore. And Will Hadley, who had never once thought he could walk toward the mountains, took a step forward. Before we go on, I want to know, what country are you listening from today? Drop it in the comments. It means the world to me to know where this story is reaching. Now let's go back, because Will Hadley still has some things to do. He went to the store the next morning. Good shirt, combed hair, the particular expression of a man who has made a decision and is done deliberating. Daniel was behind the counter. He looked at Will, the shirt, the hair, the expression, and said nothing. Simply called toward the back, Rose, Will Hadley's here. Footsteps. Then she came through the door and stopped, and the look she gave him was clear and direct and without any of the careful patience she'd been carrying for years. Just, "You're here." "I'd like to come calling on you properly," Will said, "starting today. And I'd like your father's permission." Daniel, behind the counter, found something extremely interesting to examine on the shelf behind him. "You have it," he said, to the shelf. Rose looked at Will. Something in her had settled. The long-held breath finally released. "You know," she said, "most men who come calling bring flowers." He looked at his empty hands. "I'll bring them tomorrow." "Is there going to be a tomorrow?" "Every day," he said, "for as long as you'll have me." She looked at him for one moment more. Then she smiled. The real one, his one, the one he understood now had always been waiting for him to recognize it. "Then you'd better not be late," she said. What followed was the most discussed courtship in Crest Falls' recent history. He brought wildflowers the next day, not bought, just noticed and picked, and she put them in a jar on the store counter without explaining them to anyone, which caused considerable speculation. He came to Tuesday's supper at the Callahans. Ruth had set the best table since Christmas. Daniel was warm. Rose sat across from Will, and they talked the way they always had, easily, with the dry humor that had always been between them. Except now, neither of them was pretending it was merely neighborly. On a Sunday in September, they rode to the ridge above the valley, where you could see the whole county spread below, mountains behind, golden grass ahead. They sat in the late afternoon light and talked about real things. "Why me?" he asked, genuinely. "There were better prospects." "Because you never performed anything," she said. "Every other man who came was showing me something, his land, his money, his standing. You just showed up, the same every time." She looked at the valley. "I always knew exactly who you were. That's rarer than people think." He was quiet. Then he said, "Marsh is a good man." "He is." "You could have..." "Will." She turned to look at him directly. "I waited for you, not because I had no other choice, because you were the choice." A pause. "Don't make me explain that twice." He looked at her, at this woman who had held something quietly for years and offered it to him without conditions, and felt the specific gratitude of a man who understands, fully, what almost didn't happen. The valley was gold below them. The mountains were doing what they always did. And something that had been patient for a very long time sat down beside him on that ridge and stopped waiting. October in Wyoming arrives without negotiation. The cold comes fast, the light sharpens, and the mountains show their first snow on the high peaks, while the valley grass goes from gold to brown. He asked her on an October evening, outside the general store after the harvest social. He had his grandmother's ring in his breast pocket, a simple gold band he'd cleaned carefully and carried for 2 weeks, waiting for a moment that felt honest rather than staged. He stopped at the store steps and turned to her. "Rose," he said, "I need to say something plainly, because I've been unclear for long enough, and you deserve better than unclear." She looked at him, those eyes, green tonight in the cold October light. "I love you," he said. "I think I have for years, which I know is not a point in my favor. But I know it now, clearly, the way I know the things I'm most certain of. And I would like very much for you to be my wife." A pause. "If you're willing to take on a man who was slow and is trying to make up for lost time." Rose looked at him. "Will Hadley," she said, "you are the least romantic man in Wyoming." "I know." That proposal was approximately half as poetic as the occasion called for. "I know that, too." A pause. The cold wind moved through the empty street. Then, "Yes," she said. Simply, finally, after years of patience, the word that had always been waiting. Yes. He put the ring on her finger on the store steps in the October air, and she looked at it the way you look at something you recognize. Not new, but finally, completely yours. They were married in November, before the first hard snow. The church was full. Half of Crestfall felt, with some justification, that they had personally invested in this outcome and had earned their place at the celebration. George Alcott, in the third pew, was observed to be unusually moved for a man who claimed no feelings about romantic matters. Rose wore her mother's wedding dress, taken in at the waist. She walked toward Will with the unhurried certainty of a woman arriving somewhere she had always been headed. Will stood at the front of the church and watched her come, and felt, with sudden complete clarity, how close he had come to missing this. How a man could stand next to something extraordinary for years and fail to see it. How Edward Marsh had almost made the offer. How another week of his own blindness might have changed everything. He was not going to waste another day of it. They said their vows simply. They meant every word. The years that followed were good ones, built from honest work and the warmth of two people who genuinely liked each other and never stopped being glad to come home. The livery grew. Rose kept the accounts and discovered within the first year that Will had been undercharging for his work, which she corrected with the brisk efficiency of someone who grew up in commerce. He didn't argue. He had learned quickly that on matters of numbers and cents, Rose was simply right. Their son arrived in the second year. They named him Thomas, for Will's grandfather, a boy with his mother's eyes and his father's patient, deliberate way of moving through the world. Their daughter came in the fourth year. They named her Eliza, quick and bright and funny in the dry way that Rose had always been, which made the house considerably louder and considerably more alive. On a summer evening in their sixth year, Rose was hanging laundry in the yard when Will came home from the livery, still dusty, and stopped at the gate to watch her. She was humming. She always hummed at the repetitive work, and the Wyoming evening light was gold the way it gets in July, and the mountains were doing what they always did, and Will Hadley stood at his own gate and looked at his wife. She noticed him, turned. "You're staring," she said. "I know. You used to never stare." "I used to not know what I was looking at," he said. "I've corrected that." She smiled. The real one. His. He came through the gate and crossed the yard and took the laundry basket from her hands and set it down and held her in the gold evening light. She rested her head against his chest. The children's voices came from inside the house, Thomas and Eliza arguing about something with the passionate conviction of children who have inherited stubbornness from both sides. And Will Hadley held his wife in the evening light and thought about Edward Marsh, and about George's voice in the stable that Monday morning, and about how close it had all come to going differently. He was grateful in the way you're only grateful when you understand what almost didn't happen. He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "I see you," he said quietly. She didn't ask what he meant. She already knew. She had always known. She'd just been waiting for him to say it. Years later, when Eliza was old enough to ask, she asked her mother how she had known. They were in the kitchen, Rose teaching Eliza to make the pie that had become something of a family institution, and the question came sideways, in the middle of something else entirely. "How did you know Papa was the one, before he knew?" Rose was quiet a moment, working the dough. "He never performed anything," she said finally. "Every man who came along was showing me something. Your father just showed up, the same every time." A pause. "And he was worth waiting for." Eliza considered this. "But you almost didn't wait, because of Mr. Marsh." Rose looked at her daughter, Will's eyes in her face. "Yes," she said honestly. Almost. She handed Eliza the rolling pin. That's the part I want you to remember, not the happy ending, the almost. She looked at her. Know what you want. Don't perform for anyone. And if the person you're waiting for is slow, give him time, but not forever. A pause. At some point, you say the true thing. You give him the chance to show up. What if he doesn't? Rose was quiet for a moment. Then you know, and you move forward. She covered her daughter's hands with hers on the rolling pin. But Eliza, in my experience, when you say the true thing to the right person, she smiled. They show up. Rose waited, but she didn't wait passively. She lived fully. She showed up every day as exactly herself, without performing, without shrinking. And when the moment came, when she understood that time was no longer on her side, she said the true thing on a dusty street and walked away without waiting for his reaction. That is not a small act. That took more courage than anything Will did. And Will isn't a villain. He's something more recognizable. A man so convinced that something wonderful was beyond his reach that he never reached. Until the morning George Alcott told him about Edward Marsh. Until the moment the clock that had been running quietly became suddenly, undeniably audible. Sometimes we need that. Sometimes the thing that makes us finally move is not the presence of love. We already had that. But the understanding that love, like everything worth having, is not guaranteed to wait forever. They chose each other, deliberately, at the last possible moment, but still in time. That's the part worth holding on to. Thank you for listening today. Wherever you are, I'm grateful you were here. Until next time, keep writing. Montana, 1882.
Go! Faster!
Caleb Morrison had faced a lot of things in his 22 years. He had faced a horse that threw in 3 times before he finally stayed on. He had faced a Montana winter alone in a lined shack with nothing but dried beans and stubbornness. He had faced a cattle stampede at 16 that had left him with a scar on his left forearm and a story he still told badly. None of it had prepared him for the front porch of the Reed Ranch. He stood at the gate on a Thursday morning in October, with his hat in his hands and his heart doing something unreasonable in his chest, looking at the house where Frank Reed was almost certainly inside, and thought about turning around. He had thought about turning around every day for 3 months. Frank Reed was 55 years old, 6 feet and 2 inches of Montana rancher, with a beard gone gray before its time and eyes that had the quality of a man who has seen enough to know exactly what he's looking at. The kind of man other men described as fair. What they meant was that he was fair the way weather is fair, consistently, without sentiment, and entirely without interest in what you thought about it. Caleb was 22 years old. He owned a horse, a saddle, a good knife, and approximately $14. He worked for wages on the Henderson operation 6 miles east, which paid decently for seasonal work and not at all in winter. He was by any reasonable measurement too poor for Frank Reed's daughter. He knew this. He had known it for the entire 3 months he had been trying not to fall in love with Annie Reed, which had been approximately as successful as trying not to notice the sunrise. He opened the gate. He walked to the porch, he knocked, and when Frank Reed opened the door and looked at him with those eyes, Caleb Morrison said the truest and most terrifying thing he had ever said to another human being. "Mr. Reed, I'd like to speak with you about Annie." It had started, as most things in Caleb's life started, with a fence. Specifically, the fence line between the Henderson property and the Reed property, which had a section that came down every spring when the creek flooded, and which, in the spring of 1882, had come down on the Henderson side, which technically made it Henderson's problem, which meant Caleb was the one fixing it. He had been out there for 2 hours on a May morning, driving posts into ground that was still soft from the melt, when he heard someone on the other side of the fence line. He looked up. Annie Reed was 19 years old, with dark, wavy hair that she kept in a loose braid, and the specific directness of a person who grew up knowing exactly where things were and how they worked. She was checking the Reed fence line, the section on her side, which was also down, which meant she was doing her father's fence work on a Saturday morning without being asked, which Caleb noted. "Henderson side?" she said, by way of greeting.
Yes, he said. We're down on our side, too.
She looked at the damage with the assessing eye of someone who has repaired fences before. "That post has been soft since last fall. Papa kept saying he'd get to it." "I can do your side too," Caleb said, "while I'm here." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You don't have to." "I know," he said. He fixed the Henderson side, then he fixed the Reed side. She brought him water halfway through, which he accepted, and they talked for 20 minutes about the fence and the flood and the Henderson cattle and whether the spring was coming early or late. And when he rode home that evening, he was already in trouble, and he knew it. He saw her 4 more times before June, always at some distance, always briefly. Each time he rode away, feeling like a man who had been standing too close to a fire and had not moved away when he should have. By July, he had stopped pretending this was going to resolve itself without his involvement. Ruth Reed had been married to Frank for 28 years and had developed in that time the specific skill of seeing things her husband was going to need 3 weeks to arrive at on his own. She saw Caleb Morrison the first time he came to the Reed property. Not to speak to Frank, not yet. Just passing through on an errand for Henderson that happened to bring him within conversation distance of the front porch where Annie was shelling peas. Ruth watched from the kitchen window. She watched him take his hat off when he spoke to Annie. She watched him listen when Annie spoke, actually listen, not wait. She watched him laugh at something Annie said with the genuine laugh of a person who has been surprised into it. She watched Annie watch him right away. That evening at supper, she said nothing about it. Frank was talking about the north pasture and the price of beef in Billings, and Ruth listened and said the appropriate things, and thought about a young man who took his hat off and listened. "Annie was talking to the Henderson hand today," Frank said eventually. Ruth said. "Young fellow, Morrison, I think." Ruth said. Frank looked at her. In 28 years, he had learned that Ruth's had approximately 14 different meanings, and this particular one meant she knew something he didn't. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Pass the bread." Frank passed the bread with the expression of a man who knows he is behind on information and is not sure how to catch up. Ruth buttered her bread with the serenity of a woman who has already decided how the story ends and is simply waiting for everyone else to get there. October arrived, and Caleb ran out of reasons to wait. He had spent the summer finding legitimate reasons to be near the Reed property. Fence repairs, cattle questions, returning a tool Henderson had borrowed from Frank years ago that Henderson had no memory of borrowing. Each time he saw Annie. Each time the conversation was good. Each time he rode away more certain and more afraid. In September, Annie had looked at him across the Reed kitchen table. Ruth had invited him for coffee after he helped bring in a section of fence that had come down in a storm, which Ruth had engineered with the precision of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing, and said, very simply, "You always find a reason to come by." "The fences," he said. "The fences are fine, Caleb." He looked at his coffee. "Yes," he said.
I always find a reason.
She had smiled at him with an expression that was not a question. So he came in October, hat in hands, $14, and the particular terror of a young man who has decided to do the honest thing regardless of how it lands. Frank answered the door, looked at him, said nothing. "Mr. Reed," Caleb said, "I'd like to speak with you about Annie." Frank looked at him for a long moment. Then he stepped aside. "Come in," he said. They sat at the kitchen table. Ruth appeared with coffee that she had clearly already had ready, which meant she had been expecting this, which Caleb found simultaneously comforting and alarming. He said it plainly, because he didn't know how to say things any other way.
I care about Annie. I'd like to court her properly, with your permission. He looked at the table. I know I'm too poor for your daughter, Mr. Reed. I don't have land or savings or anything much to offer, except that I work hard, and I mean what I say, and I would... He stopped, started again. I would spend my life making sure she never regretted it. The kitchen was very quiet. Frank Reed looked at this young man, the worn shirt, the hat in the hands, the $14 visible in the complete absence of anything else, and said nothing for long enough that Caleb's heart had time to do several unreasonable things. Then Frank said, "She needs a good man, not a rich one." He paused. "But I'm not giving you my answer today." He looked at Caleb with those fair weather eyes. "I'm going to give you something first, and we'll see what you do with it." The something Frank gave him was this. The Harlan property, 8 miles north, was the hardest piece of ranching land in the county. Old Jim Harlan had died in August, leaving the operation to his son, who was 19 and had no experience, and was going to lose the entire winter's cattle if he didn't have help. Frank had agreed to send a hand. "You'll spend the winter there," Frank said. "No wages. The boy can't pay. You'll work from October through March and come back in the spring." Caleb looked at him. "And if I do?" he said. "Then we'll talk," Frank said, which was not a yes, which was not a promise, which was, Caleb understood, entirely the point. He said yes before Frank had finished the sentence. Frank noted this without showing that he noted it. Ruth, who was refilling coffee that didn't need refilling, noted it too, and was considerably less subtle about her expression, which Frank chose not to look at. Annie heard the entire conversation from the hallway. She had not been invited to participate and had participated anyway, silently, from 6 feet away. And when Caleb came out, she was standing by the door with an expression that was equal parts worried and proud. "The Harlan place," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. "It's hard land." "I know." "Jim Harlan broke 2 hands and a foreman in 10 years. "I know that too." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, in a voice low enough that Frank couldn't hear from the kitchen, "Come back in the spring." It was not a declaration. It was not a promise. It was simply a direction, delivered with the confidence of someone who has already decided how things are going to go and is informing the relevant parties. Caleb put his hat on and walked to his horse and rode north. And Ruth Reed watched him go from the kitchen window and said to no one in particular, "He said yes before Frank finished the sentence." Frank behind her said nothing, but he was watching too.
Before we go on, I want to stop for just a moment.
From the United States to Australia, from Canada to the United Kingdom, from Ireland to New Zealand, wherever you are, thank you for riding along. If this story is giving you a good evening, a like means more than you know. And now, what country are you listening from today? Drop it in the comments. Now, let's get back, because Caleb Morrison is about to find out what he's made of. The Harlan property was, as advertised, hard. The land was rocky and exposed, catching every wind that came down from the Canadian border with nothing to slow it. The barn needed work. The cattle were poorly managed. Old Jim had done his best in his last years, but his best had been declining. And young Thomas Harlan, 19 and earnest and completely overwhelmed, greeted Caleb on the first day with the expression of a drowning man seeing a rope. "I don't know what I'm doing," Thomas said, by way of introduction. "That's all right," Caleb said. "I do." What Caleb had not expected was how much Thomas reminded him of himself at 19. Not in circumstance, but in quality. The same willingness to admit what he didn't know, the same determination to learn it, the same understanding that the land didn't care about your feelings, and the only response to that was to pay attention and keep working. He found himself teaching with a patience he didn't know he had, not because it was required of him, but because Thomas deserved it. Deserved someone who showed up and stayed and didn't make him feel stupid for not knowing things he'd had no one to teach him. By November, Thomas could read weather well enough to move cattle before a storm. By December, he understood the feeding rotation. By January, he was doing half the work without being directed. Caleb wrote to Annie twice, short letters, practical. She wrote back longer ones, describing the Reed Ranch in winter, the snow coming down the mountain, what her mother had said about something that made them both laugh. She was choosing every word, he could tell. Writing the way you write when you want someone to feel the thing you're describing, not just read it. He read her letters 4 times each. He didn't tell her that. In February, the worst storm of the winter came down from Canada, and Caleb spent 36 hours straight moving cattle, fixing collapsed fence in temperatures that turned breath to ice, keeping Thomas from 3 decisions that would have cost them the herd. When it was over, he sat in the Harlan kitchen drinking the worst coffee he had ever tasted and thought, "This boy is going to be all right." And then he thought, "I want a son like this someday." And then he stopped thinking and went to sleep. Frank Reed did not sit idle that winter. He asked questions. Not obviously. Frank Reed did not do anything, obviously. But with the deliberate patience of a man conducting an investigation he has not announced. He asked Henderson about Caleb. Henderson said he was the best hand he'd had in 5 years, and the only one who fixed things without being asked twice. Frank noted this. He asked Jim Harlan's neighbor, Pete Connell, how the Morrison boy was managing up north. Pete said he'd ridden past the Harlan place in December, and the cattle looked better than they had in 3 years, and the Harlan kid had been out working the fence line in weather that would keep most men inside. Frank noted this too. He said nothing to Ruth about any of it. Ruth, who had her own sources, already knew everything he had found out and several things he hadn't, and said nothing either, because 28 years of marriage had taught her when to speak and when to let a man arrive somewhere on his own. What Frank was doing, though he would not have described it this way, was building a case, not against Caleb, for him. He was assembling the evidence the way he assembled everything, carefully, without rushing, making sure the structure would hold. Because Frank Reed understood something that Caleb didn't yet know, that the test was never really about the Harlan property. The test was about what a man does when there's no guarantee, when the answer might be no. When the work is hard and the winter is long and nobody owes him anything. The test was about what he was made of. And Frank, who prided himself on reading men accurately, thought he already knew. But he was going to wait for the spring anyway, because some things need to be completed before they can be confirmed. And because Ruth had told him 3 times already that he was being stubborn, and he had told her 3 times that he was being thorough. And neither of them was entirely wrong. Caleb rode back to the Reed Ranch on the 15th of March. The snow was still on the high peaks, but the valley was showing the first green of spring, and the creek between the Henderson and Reed properties was running full and clear the way it had run the morning he'd fixed the fence and met Annie for the first time. He had $14 when he left in October. He had $14 when he came back, because the Harlan work had paid nothing, which was the arrangement. and because he had spent the winter keeping himself and Thomas and 60 head of cattle alive, rather than accumulating wealth. He was aware of the $14.
He rode to the Reed Ranch anyway. Frank was on the porch. It was as if he hadn't moved since October, except that he was wearing a lighter jacket, and the mountains behind him were different colors. Caleb tied his horse at the gate, walked to the porch, stood where he had stood in October. "Mr. Reed?" he said. Frank looked at him for a long moment. "Pete Connell tells me the Harlan cattle came through the winter in better shape than they've been in years," Frank said. "Thomas worked hard," Caleb said. "He learned fast. Pete also says you fixed the north fence in the February storm, 36 hours. It needed fixing." Frank was quiet for a moment. "You still have nothing," he said. "Yes, sir," Caleb said. "I still have nothing." "And you're still here?" "Yes, sir." Frank Reed looked at this young man, 22 years old, worn from a hard winter, $14 and a horse, standing on his porch in March with the expression of someone who has done what was asked and is not pretending it was easy and is not asking for credit, and felt something shift in his chest that he would have described, if pressed, as satisfaction. "Come inside," he said. "Ruth has coffee." It was not a yes, but it was the closest Frank Reed came to one before he was ready. The coffee was good. Ruth's coffee was always good, which Caleb had noticed in October and noticed again now, and he said so, which made Ruth look at him with the expression she had been wearing since the fence conversation in May. The expression of a woman whose conclusions have been confirmed repeatedly and who is no longer surprised by any of it. They sat at the kitchen table, Frank, Ruth, Caleb, and there was a moment of silence that had several things in it. Then Ruth said, "Annie's been corresponding with you." "Yes, ma'am," Caleb said. "She wrote 6 letters. I wrote 4 back," he said. "I didn't know how many was appropriate." Ruth looked at Frank. Frank looked at his coffee. "It was appropriate," Ruth said. Another silence. "The Harlan boy," Frank said. "Thomas, how is he set for next winter?" "He'll manage," Caleb said. "He knows what he's doing now. He might need help with the north fence before October. That section is going to come down again. But the cattle management he has." Frank nodded slowly. "You taught him. He learned fast," Caleb said again. "You keep saying that," Frank said. "That he learned fast, that the cattle came through because Thomas worked hard." He looked at Caleb directly. "You don't take credit for things." Caleb looked at the table. "It doesn't seem right to." Frank was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Ruth refilled everyone's coffee with the serenity of a woman who knows exactly how this ends and is simply waiting for the last page to turn. Then Frank said, "I built this ranch from nothing. 28 years ago, I had a horse and a saddle and Ruth, and about as much money as you have right now." Caleb looked up. "Ruth's father thought I was too poor for her," Frank said. "He was right, technically. I was." He looked at his coffee. "He gave me a year to prove otherwise. I spent that year working his land for nothing." He paused. "I thought you should know that." The kitchen was very quiet. Ruth was looking at the window with the expression of a woman who has been waiting 28 years for her husband to tell that story to the right person. Caleb Morrison sat at the kitchen table and understood, with the specific clarity of a young man receiving information that rearranges everything, that the test had never been Frank's idea at all. It had been the only thing Frank knew how to give. Frank gave his answer that afternoon, not formally. Frank Reed did not do things formally. He gave it the way he gave everything, plainly, without decoration, while doing something else. They were on the porch after lunch, looking at the valley, when Frank said,
You'll need to find work for the summer. Henderson will take you back. By fall, you'll have enough saved for a start." Caleb looked at him. "The south pasture on this property hasn't been properly grazed in 2 years," Frank continued. "Man who knew what he was doing could run 20 head there this season without crowding the main herd." He paused. "That man would need to negotiate terms with me." "What kind of terms?" Caleb asked carefully. "Fair ones," Frank said. Caleb understood. He was being given a start, not given, offered, on terms, which was the right way, and he knew it. "Yes, sir," he said. "I'd like that." Frank nodded once, then he went inside. Annie appeared from around the side of the house approximately 40 seconds later, which meant she had been listening from the corner, which Caleb had suspected, and which made him smile in a way he couldn't entirely control. "The south pasture," she said. 20 head, he said. She looked at him with the expression she had had at the fence line in May. "He told you about his father-in-law," she said. "Yes." "Mama said he'd tell you when he was ready." She paused. "She's been waiting 8 months." He laughed. She laughed. The Montana spring held them both. The mountains, the new grass, the creek running clear between the properties. He wrote her 6 letters that winter, she would tell him years later. She had written 6. She had counted. He took her hand. The first time standing in the reed yard in the March sun, and she held it with the complete naturalness of something that has found its place. "I still have $14, he said. "I know," she said. "You'll have more by September." "Is that enough time?" he said. She looked at him with Annie Reed's eyes, direct and unafraid and entirely certain. "It's exactly enough time," she said. They were married in September of 1882, on a Saturday, in the Millbrook Church. Ruth Reed cried from the front pew with the unashamed satisfaction of a woman whose conclusions had been correct for 18 months. Frank Reed stood beside her with the expression of a man who is moved and would prefer not to show it, which everyone could see through immediately, and which Frank was aware of and had decided to endure with dignity. Caleb wore his good shirt and stood at the altar and watched Annie walk toward him and thought about a fence in May and a porch in October and a Montana winter that had felt, at times, very long, and understood that every day of it had been entirely worth it. Annie wore a cream dress her mother had made, with her dark hair properly arranged. She walked with the certainty of a woman who has known where she was going for quite some time. They settled on the Reed property that first year, the south pasture arrangement with Frank, which expanded in the spring to include a partnership that neither of them had formally proposed, but both had understood was coming. Caleb was the kind of man who fixed things without being asked twice. The Reed operation was considerably better managed by the following spring. Frank noticed, said nothing directly, but he began consulting Caleb on decisions in a way that was not quite asking for advice, but was not quite not asking either. Ruth noticed this and said nothing, which took considerable discipline. Their son arrived in June of 1883. They named him Thomas. Ruth looked at Caleb when she heard the name and said nothing, but her expression said everything. Frank said, "Thomas, after the Harlan boy." Caleb said simply, "He deserved something." Frank was quiet for a moment, then, "Good name." Thomas came into the world with his father's dark, curly hair and his mother's direct gaze, and from the first moment Frank Reed held him, standing in the bedroom doorway, the baby in his arms, looking at this small person who had arrived with the particular authority of someone who intends to be here. Something happened to Frank Reed's face that Ruth had seen only a few times in 28 years. He went soft. Not visibly, not dramatically, but Ruth saw it. The specific softening of a man who has been strong for a very long time and is found in the weight of a child in his arms
something that does not require strength. He held Thomas for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at Caleb, who was standing near the window watching him, and said, "Good boy." Caleb understood he was not talking about Thomas. On a Sunday afternoon that summer, the Reed property was full in the way it had not been full since Annie was small. Frank on the porch with Thomas on his knee, talking to the baby with the seriousness of a man who has decided this person deserves real conversation. Ruth in the doorway, watching with the expression she had worn since May of the previous year. Caleb and Annie in the yard together. The Montana mountains were doing what they always did. The creek was running clear between the properties. And Frank Reed, who had tested a young man with a hard winter and $14 and no promises, sat on his porch with his grandson and was, by every measure he knew how to apply, entirely satisfied with how things had turned out. Frank Reed gave Caleb Morrison the hardest winter of his life. No wages, no guarantee, no promise that yes was waiting at the end. Just work, just the test, just the question of what a man does when nobody owes him anything. And Caleb, 22 years old, $14, worn shirt, said yes before Frank finished the sentence. That's the moment that matters. Not the wedding, not the South pasture deal, not even the spring when Frank told him about Ruth's father. The moment that mattered was the fraction of a second between the end of Frank's offer and the beginning of Caleb's answer. When a young man with nothing looked at a hard winter with no guarantee and said yes anyway. Because that is what character looks like before it has anything to prove itself with. Frank Reed knew this. He had lived it himself 28 years ago on a different piece of land with a different father-in-law who had given him the same gift. Not the easy yes, but the chance to show what he was made of. The richest thing Caleb Morrison brought to the Reed family was not what he built in the summer of 1882. It was what he did in the winter, when it was cold and hard, and nobody was watching, and there was no reward but the work itself. Ruth had known from May. Frank had known from the moment Caleb said yes before the sentence was finished. Annie had known from the fence line in spring. Some people, when they show up completely, from the very beginning, and the ones who love them, who are paying attention, see it immediately. The rest is just time. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you, truly, from the bottom of my heart. These stories exist because of you. Every comment, every like, every person who shares an episode with someone they love. That is what keeps this going. Wherever you are today, in the United States, in Australia, in Canada, in the United Kingdom, in Ireland, in New Zealand, I hope Caleb and Annie and Frank and Ruth gave you something warm to carry. May God bless each and every one of you who listened today. Until next time, keep writing.